Today is Saturday, July 4th, 2026, and today is Independence Day, a day that we remember our 250th birthday. A day of fireworks, backyard cookouts, and convincing yourself that this is the year you'll finally light the sparkler without burning your fingers. But after digging through today's stories, I noticed that they all had something in common. They didn't end when the moment was over. Two founding fathers left behind ideas that outlived them. One writer stepped into the woods and inspired generations to think differently about life. And one radio personality helped give a new kind of music a name the world would never forget. Some moments echo. Others become part of who we are. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and a person who keeps discovering that history is somehow both fascinating and deeply concerning at the same time. The 4th of July already held a special place in American history, but in 1826 it became something almost unbelievable. On July 4th, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was adopted, two of America's founding fathers died, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. It's one of the most remarkable coincidences in American history. These weren't just any two former presidents. Jefferson wrote most of the Declaration of Independence. Adams was one of its fiercest champions, helping persuade the Continental Congress that independence wasn't just possible, it was necessary. They had been friends, then political rivals. Their disagreements became so intense that they spent years barely speaking to one another. Eventually, thanks in part to mutual friends, they began exchanging letters again. Over the final 14 years of their lives, they wrote more than 150 letters discussing politics, philosophy, aging, friendship, and the future of the country they had helped create. Those letters remain one of the greatest correspondences in American history. Then came July 4th, 1826. Jefferson, gravely ill at his home in Monticello, died earlier in the afternoon. Hundreds of miles away in Massachusetts, John Adams lay dying as well. According to those at his bedside, his final words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." It's a sentence that still gives me the chills. Adams believed his old friend had outlived him. He didn't know Jefferson had actually died several hours earlier. History rarely offers moments this poetic. I've always wondered if anyone could have written that ending and had people believe it. Sometimes the truth really is stranger and somehow more meaningful than fiction. Of course, not every lasting legacy is built in government. Sometimes it's built in a tiny cabin in the woods. On July 4th, 1845, Henry David Thoreau moved into a small cabin he had built beside Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. People often picture Thoreau as someone who disappeared into the wilderness to escape civilization. That's not really what happened. His cabin was only about 2 miles from town. Friends visited. He visited them. He walked into Concord regularly. If he needed supplies, he wasn't exactly crossing the Arctic. The point wasn't isolation. The point was intention. Thoreau wanted to answer a simple question. How much do we actually need to live a meaningful life? He believed many people spent so much time chasing possessions and status that they never stopped to ask whether those things made them any happier. So he simplified. He built a modest cabin, grew some of his own food, read, wrote, observed nature, and paid close attention to the everyday details most of us overlook. The experience became the foundation for Walden, one of the most influential books ever written about simple living. More than a century and a half later, people still quote Thoreau when talking about minimalism, environmentalism, mindfulness, and even work-life balance. That's remarkable. A man who deliberately slowed his life down ended up influencing generations of people trying to make sense of a much faster world. And our final story reminds us, sometimes changing history doesn't require inventing something new. Sometimes it starts by giving people the right words. On July 4th, 1950, radio disc jockey Alan Freed began using the phrase that would soon become one of the most recognizable names in music history, rock and roll. Now, to be fair, Alan Freed did not invent rock and roll. The music already existed. Black musicians had been blending rhythm and blues, gospel, jazz, boogie-woogie, and country influences for years. Artists like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Fats Domino, Wynonie Harris, Louis Jordan, and many others had already laid the foundation. Freed's contribution was different. He became one of the first major radio personalities to enthusiastically play those records for a broader audience. At a time when many radio stations were segregated by both music and audience, Freed ignored those invisible lines. He believed great music was great music. He promoted black artists to listeners who otherwise might never have heard them. And in doing so, he helped introduce an entire generation to a new sound. The phrase rock and roll had existed in African American slang and song lyrics long before Freed adopted it, but he helped bring the name into the mainstream. Sometimes that's enough to change history, not because you created something, but because you helped the rest of the world discover it. It's fascinating how often cultural revolutions don't begin with inventors. They begin with connectors, people who recognize something special and convince everyone else to pay attention. And looking back across today's stories, they all involved ideas that continued to echo long after the people behind them were gone. That makes today's birthday feel like a perfect fit, because for decades, one woman's words quietly found their way into millions of homes. Born on July 4th, 1918, Ann Landers became one of the most trusted voices in American newspapers. Long before people searched the internet for advice, before social media, before online forums, people wrote letters, real letters. They poured out their worries about marriage, family, friendships, grief, money, and the countless little problems that come with being human. Then they mailed those deeply personal questions to someone they had never met. That's the remarkable part to me. Millions of people trusted Ann Landers because they believed she would answer honestly. Her column eventually appeared in more than 1,200 newspapers and reached an estimated 90 million readers. That's an astonishing number. But I don't think her success came from having perfect answers. It came from asking readers to be a little kinder, a little more patient, and a little more understanding with each other. Sometimes history remembers presidents, inventors, or celebrities. Sometimes it remembers the person who simply helped people feel a little less alone. And looking back across today's stories, I kept thinking about echoes. Jefferson and Adams helped launch a nation whose ideals are still being debated nearly 250 years later. Thoreau asked whether a simpler life might be a better one. And people are still asking that same question. Alan Freed helped introduce a musical movement that changed popular culture around the world. And Ann Landers reminded millions of readers that wisdom doesn't always come from grand speeches. Sometimes it arrives one thoughtful conversation at a time. Ideas have a funny way of outliving the people who first shared them. The voices eventually fall silent. The echoes keep going. Anyway, on a day that's often filled with fireworks, maybe it's worth remembering that the brightest flashes don't always leave the longest light. Sometimes it's the quiet ideas that continue illuminating the path long after the celebration is over. And I'll leave you with this thought from Henry David Thoreau. It's not what you look at that matters. It's what you see. If you'd like to hear more of my work, narration, podcasts, or other projects, you can find it all at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and thanks for wandering through history with me for a while. I'll see you tomorrow.